Clausewitz's name is dropped repeatedly throughout all corners and services of the military. However, despite his notoriety, and perhaps because of his staff officer thoughts on logistics, his definition of war falls well short of the way America actively employs its troops. This overemphasis of Clausewitz actually confuses the fighting line and blunts the tip of the nation's spear. My Common Soldier's quibble with Clausewitz starts on page 1 of Clausewitz on War. Reading from my cheap Pacific Publishing Studio public domain reprint, Clausewitz claims, quote, "War therefore is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will." This definition is problematic on a number of levels. This definition does not fully describe nor encapsulate the totality of the warfighter's toolkit. I'm thinking here civil affairs, information and deception operations are definitely excluded, and PSYOP is potentially excluded. And 2, this definition decouples the kinetic operation from the strategy that launched the operation in the first place. This decoupling is famously identified by Colonel Boyd and his OODA loop theory, which at its heart is all about reading the enemy's intent prior to committing to action. Now, I'm a known critic of Colonel Boyd and the so-called fighter mafia. However, I think anyone is philosophically blind if they cannot see the quandary in which Colonel Boyd's OODA loop places General Clausewitz's definition of war. I think in this regard, Colonel Boyd is onto something. In all matters of war, intent matters more than the actual violence. Knowing your enemy's intent leaves a soldier the option to employ non-violent remedies to the situation, whatever the level that situation has reached. For those paying attention, this is the common soldier's application of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The infamous Cuban Missile Crisis represents the pinnacle of dueling intents, but lesser situations abound. And my drill sergeant at basic used to always talk about going thermonuclear. So this is how common soldiers think. To phrase this in terms of the ongoing debate, you cannot provoke a so-called dilemma for the enemy without both knowing the enemy's intent and also adjusting or adopting your original intent. Thus, this process of adapting might see a commander shift from a planned kinetic operation to an off-the-cuff non-kinetic one, or vice versa. It is with this in mind that we must consider the lesson America learned from 9/11. Namely that human nature, the so-called politics, is often incidental to the actual violence. Does anyone in America genuinely care about the politics of the hijackers? No. All anyone cares about is the fact that the World Trade Center was attacked and that the people responsible for that attack needed to be brought to justice. Indeed, there is no other way to even identify an enemy that does not wear a uniform other than through knowing or perceiving that enemy's evil intent and then preventing that evil intent from manifesting itself. Thus, a correct definition of war is to say, war exists whenever there is a human intent to violence, and it is incumbent on nation states to prevent the actual commission of that intended violence through whatever means necessary. This includes preemptive action. The American military has a long tradition of tackling these criminal problems outside the jurisdiction of the local sheriff, so to speak. All the wars out west and in Florida during the early years of America represent this use of the military to pursue gangs of criminals that were terrorizing frontier communities. My old unit, the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, has served in some of those actions. But the use of military in this capacity predates the American Revolution. As I flip the pages of On War, Chapter 1, I continue to quibble with some of the minor points. However, suffice it for now for me to say that by redefining war, we cannot accept Clausewitz's thesis, point 24, that, quote, war is a mere continuation of policy by other means. In my own experience, as discussed earlier, I have witnessed the politics come after the enemy's act of violence. When you get right down to it, it doesn't really matter why an enemy is engaging in violence. The only concern is to stop that violence. Clausewitz's definition does nothing to account for so-called non-state actors. It can be said that the American military's love affair with Clausewitz and his thesis set the stage for the 9/11 attacks. Of course, many changes have been made across the board since the 9/11 attacks, and I'm merely pointing out that Clausewitz never foresaw the level of both information technology and interagency cooperation between government and military organizations required to execute warfare post 9/11. The final quibble I have with Clausewitz is the confusion over the translation of policy or politics. Translating the word as politics suggests that the military is an extension of the legislative branch, and this is a patently silly idea. Politics and politicians are unreliable at best, and each representative only represents a part of the nation's constituency. The military is an executive function, and therefore the only sensible translation is policy. Thus, nation-state executives must have a coherent military policy. However, this policy must never be, quote, violent in and of itself. The policy must always be, as Colonel Boyd suggests, designed to create a dilemma so as to be seen as, quote, strategically defensive, yet always at the ready to use the proportional amount of force against any and all aggressive actors, be that actor an individual, a violent non-state gang, or another nation state. I hope this was useful.